Boy, there's so much going on that I think I can limit today's video to a single topic. My single topic format has been, has forced me recently to not talk about a bunch of stories that I think were important, because I do only do this once a day. So I guess today I'll start with this whole India-China situation, which I've wanted to talk about the last couple days. I had other things that I thought were more pressing from a domestic standpoint, but internationally, I think the India-China news is probably the biggest story in the world, because you have two nuclear powers that were getting into border skirmishes, and there's been a lot going on between India and China for a while that I've been monitoring the last couple of years. It's up in the Himalayas. It's quite interesting to think of, where India and China meet, because you think of those as being such different places. There's not exactly a bold line dividing them. And so there's, a lot of argument over this massive border between India and China, where exactly it lies. And I've seen, even as recently as a couple months ago, some pretty nasty videos of Indians arguing with Chinese soldiers. Some of them getting detained by each other. Just a lot of bad blood. And apparently that de-escalated into, or rather escalated, I should say, degenerated into violence over just recently here. And of course, there were lots of people who were saying, well, are India and China going to go to war? And this is honestly the reason why I didn't cover the issue, is I did not think that was a big danger. I did not think that was a possibility. And the reason for that is precisely, why so many people were afraid, and it's because they're both nuclear states. Well, the fact that they're both nuclear states creates a massive deterrent, for neither of them to want to start a war. They both have every incentive to try and de-escalate the situation. That is the beauty of mutually assured destruction. As scary as mutually assured destruction is, it does prevent wars that otherwise might occur. Especially when you have, a couple of bombastic, or I should say at least tough guy sort of leaders like Xi and Modi. Modi's supposed to be, big Hindu nationalist, Hindu strong. That's his whole platform. We're the best. Nobody can push us around. If China wasn't a nuclear armed state, this would have been a great opportunity for Modi to say, you know what, we're invading China, and we're going to show them that India is best country. And that's what a lot of people might expect of someone like Modi. Well, instead of coming out immediately and declaring how the Chinese are so evil, and how they, how we gotta beat China, and this is a declaration of war. China attacked us, all this stuff. Modi didn't say anything until today. He stayed totally silent. He met with his staff, talked over the situation. Apparently, was talking back and forth behind the scenes with the Chinese. And he actually worked to de-escalate the situation, which is the right thing to do. That's what you would expect any rational person to do in that situation. And so today, it was announced that India and China are coming down, they're coming down from the ledge. They are talking amongst each other. They are discussing their differences, and nothing too horrible is supposed to come about from this. They obviously aren't going to resolve their differences anytime soon, and frankly, are their differences really that big of a deal? I've heard some people talk about, well, it's about water rights, which I guess, that could be a sticking point, especially as we get into the future, as India's population grows and grows. Of course, India has a pretty hard time when it comes to clean water, because their water is so filthy. And China, of course, has the biggest population on the planet. But I don't have enough evidence to say that that's what this is all about, that's why, there's so much tension on the border here. It could be as simple as something like, the fact that China is very close with Pakistan, and so the Indians are going to look at China as their enemy. And likewise, the Chinese are going to look at India, the mortal enemy of Pakistan, as their enemy. And so when you have groups of soldiers on either sides of a pretty gray line, pointing guns at each other all the time, then that's a recipe for some violence at some point. There's certainly going to be a lot of tension in that kind of a situation. And so what we saw occur on the border these past couple days is not shocking to me. And it's something that I hope we don't see again, but I wouldn't be surprised to see again. Nevertheless, it's something that I hope will not be enough for this situation to degrade into any kind of an all-out war between India and China, because of course that would be apocalyptic. I mean, we'd be looking at nuclear winter. And so that's about all I have to say on that matter for now, until we get something else other than, maybe Xi's going to come out and talk about it, because Modi said his piece, and he's essentially said, hey, we're working things out, don't worry about it. And that, that's pretty much in line with what I was expecting. Now, coming back home to the U.S., something that happened yesterday, which is not at all surprising, is that Google decided to demonetize a couple of sites at the request of NBC News. And that was The Federalist and Zero Hedge. Now, apparently, the outrage was just over The Federalist, because I guess lots of Republicans read The Federalist, and so they were outraged about that. But Zero Hedge, to me, who was just reinstated on Twitter, is the one that I care much more about, because that is the only source of dissident financial analysis really on the internet. It's the only sort of aggregated outlet. You have individual blogs by individual people. There are individual voices, and I've gone over this before when I was just talking about Zero Hedge being reinstated on Twitter and how good I thought that was, for financial conversation. Twitter, of course, had banned Zero Hedge for being concerned about the Wu flu back in January, because back then it was considered racist to worry about the virus. And now that they've just been reinstated by Twitter, Google has banned them from monetizing any of the ads on their site, because guess why? Their criticism that they've published of the Black Lives Matter movement and the riots and all that's been occurring since the George Floyd killing is racist, according to Google. And so that's, not surprising. Everything's always about, quote-unquote racism. But what I find funny is that I haven't been on their site since then to see if this is the case. But does that mean that there's going to be no more ads on Zero Hedge? Because if so, their site will become much more usable, because they have so many damn ads on there that it really makes me nervous, like I'm going to get a virus from it. I only try and browse Zero Hedge on my phone, and even then, with the ads constantly popping in and out, the page is never stable. But of course, it doesn't matter if they can't make enough money to fund the site, then off of ads. Then if they get rid of the ads, there's going to be no site anyway. Guess they'd probably have to move to some kind of a subscription model or donations or something like that. Now, reading the story from NBC, which, the story's changed quite a bit. Originally, it said The Federalist and Zero Hedge have been demonetized at the request of NBC, which was kind of funny, taking out your competition. Pretty obvious, self-interest there on NBC's part. But the funny thing is that it's not the actual content of the articles even that Google is demonetizing these sites over. It's over the comments section, which is quite funny. Which I never read the comments section on these websites, but I guess that means that Google considers any of this sort of this social interaction to be on these sites to be acting, them acting in their capacity as a publisher, not a platform, which is pretty ironic, considering how much the right in this country has been, stressing over Section 230 and all that, and the distinction between platforms and publishers, and how, hey, if we wanted to, we could declare the social media sites to be publishers if they want to editorialize content, and then, hold them accountable for very objectionable things that leftists say. And while legally it's not like this is the same thing, because Google is not the law. It's not like they're literally applying Section 230 or anything like that to Zero Hedge or to the Federalist. They're just kind of using the same principle in in running their ads. And we've seen similar things from Google actually in the past, because they've started on YouTube, cracking down on YouTubers based on what's in the comments section. So some YouTubers, in order to preserve their monetization, have disabled comments on their videos. And that's ultimately what the Federalist ended up doing in this situation. They just removed their comments section, and now Google lets them monetize again. Zero Hedge, however, has no such luck, because they don't really have any mainstream support. Unlike the Federalist, whose editor-in-chief, I believe, is married to John McCain's daughter. So the Federalist is literally married to the establishment. They have a little bit more protection than a site like Zero Hedge. It'll be interesting to see how the technopolies fare here in the future. Because, with all this, whenever you get, stuff like this happening, people talk of, crap like antitrust, which, just irks me from an economic standpoint, because antitrust is such a nonsense, political scheme. It really has no real economic justification. In fact, the way that the Sherman antitrust law was passed, and why it was passed, was to intimidate the political enemy of the man who wrote it. He was basically threatening him that, hey, I'm going to come and destroy your business if you don't smarten up and do as I say. And when you think of it in that context, you basically making an antitrust case against a company like Google makes much more sense, because they are a political enemy of certain folks in this country, and so those folks, the right, would want to use the antitrust law to destroy them. That's the same way that the antitrust law has always been used. That's the way it was used by Roosevelt and Taft. When Roosevelt was in office, he used it to break up Rockefeller interests, and when Taft was in office, he used it to break up Morgan interests. Because each of them, worked for sort of opposing, uber rich guys. They weren't billionaires back then. There weren't any billionaires, but Taft was in the pocket of Rockefeller, and old Teddy Roosevelt was in the pocket of J.P. Morgan, both of which were Republicans, by the way. And so you're seeing a growing chorus of people now who want, within the Republican Party, who want to use, the antitrust legislation to try and harm their political enemies, who, they see as having fired the first shot, in this case being Google. And I can understand that from a purely cynical political perspective. I just, it makes me sick when people try and make an economic argument with that. It's completely tortured logic. A company can only establish, a so-called monopoly through two means. Either it's from preferential treatment from the government, which pushes out their competition, which certainly companies like Google and these other folks, completely in bed with the government, they have that. And then on the other hand, if they don't have any assistance from the government, which, in theory could be removed and then rob them of their monopoly status. If you do that, you take away their privileges and they still are the only, provider in the market, then that means that the market just doesn't support any competitors, and that there are no good competitors, in which case you can only make things worse, for the consumer by, trying to, use the law to invent new competition. That defeats the purpose of competition. Competition is supposed to make, companies perform better, not perform worse. And when it comes to these tech companies, you can't break them up like you did, even though it didn't make much sense when they broke up, so to speak, Standard Oil. If you did the same thing like with Google, to where you created 50 Google search engines, it doesn't make any difference. You have the same owners. It's going to be managed the same way. The only thing that you can really do if you wanted to, so-called break up Google is, I guess, take all their different subsidiaries like YouTube or WhatsApp or whatever and put them in the hands of right-wingers. You'd have to steal them from the current owners. You would need to seize their businesses and their property and their assets from the current owners of Google and hand them to right-wingers. That's the only way you're going to get any change, because this isn't a matter of competition. It's not that, Google can't compete, or that Google doesn't have competition. It's that they're run by left-wingers who want to take down the right. And then you could say, well, there's this whole thing. They say, oh, why don't we regulate Google? Like that's, using these, these progressive terms like, like that's a wonderful Band-Aid. That just shows how, how much the American right has truly been subjugated by the old progressive movement. When you regulate a company, you can go back to the 1870s when this first started. What you do is you create some government bureaucracy which runs the industry, and eliminates all competition, because what you're doing is you're telling everyone how they have to run their business. In the example of the Federal Trade Commission back then, what they were doing is they were telling shippers how much they have to bill for freight, and what that did was that prevented new shippers from coming in and undercutting the old shipping companies, with better prices. And in every other industry, you see a very similar pattern. And of course, the people who staff these regulatory agencies are people from that industry, and so they get what they want anyway. You never have these big companies being hurt by being, regulated. Like that's some big scary word that's supposed to hurt them and be good, because regulation, that's good for consumers and it's bad for those evil businessmen. It's quite the opposite. So I haven't seen any real specific suggestions of how the right, even from like I said, a purely cynical perspective, how they would take control of these institutions, and make their situation better. I see just a very rudimentary and suggestions of things that ultimately will do them no good. So with that said, if you get anything of value to this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.